Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a dramatic case that started with a fire on a single cargo ship back in 1977. It sparked a legal battle that lasted a decade and would completely change the answer to a huge question in global trade. When a giant container full of stuff gets lost, what exactly counts as a package?
All right, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the disaster itself, then get into the big legal question. Was this an act of God, or was someone just negligent? We'll see how the courts applied a really tough diligence test before getting to the real money question, the container conundrum, and finally, the landmark judgment that settled it all.
So, our story kicks off in June of 1977. We're on board the MS Asiatica, a cargo ship run by Eastern Shipping Lines, on what was supposed to be just another totally routine trip.
So the ship leaves Kobe, Japan, and it's headed for Manila. But somewhere out there on the open sea, a fire breaks out. Now, despite whatever the crew tried to do, the fire just raged out of control. And in the end, the MS Asiatica sank, taking its entire multi-million-dollar cargo down to the bottom of the ocean.
And you guessed it, this sinking kicks off a massive legal battle that would drag on for almost 10 years. See, the insurance companies paid out the cargo owners for their lost goods, and then they turned around and sued the shipping line to get their money back. It all came down to one critical question. Who was actually responsible here? All right, so this is where the legal fight really heats up. The shipping company had to defend itself, and its whole argument, well, it's pretty fascinating.
So, the carrier's argument was pretty simple. They claimed the fire was a fortuitous event, basically an act of God that was completely out of their control. But the insurers, they fired right back, saying, "No way, this wasn't some random accident, this was just plain old negligence." This brings up a really basic legal question, right? When we're talking law, can a fire ever be considered an act of God, in the same way a hurricane or an earthquake is? The court came back with a hard no on that one. It decided that a fire isn't a natural disaster because, unlike a storm, it pretty much always starts because of something a person did or didn't do. It doesn't just happen.
So, with that whole act of God thing thrown out the window, the shipping line is now up against a much higher legal standard, one that's specifically for companies that transport goods for other people.
And that standard is something called extraordinary diligence. This isn't just about being careful, folks. The law says that common carriers have to use the highest possible degree of care. I mean, it is an incredibly high bar to clear. And here's the real kicker. Because the cargo was lost, the law just assumes the carrier's at fault. The burden of proof wasn't on the insurance companies to show negligence. It was on the shipping line to prove they had met this crazy high standard of care. And yeah, the carrier just could not meet that standard, not even close. The court found that the fire had probably been smoldering for a full 24 hours before anyone even saw the smoke. They weren't doing regular inspections, and the crew had no idea what even caused the fire. This was like the textbook definition of not being diligent.
Okay, so the court says the carrier is liable. Case closed, right? Well, not exactly. That only solved one part of the problem. Now the court had to tackle a much more modern and much trickier puzzle. How much money did they actually owe?
You see, to make global trade work, there's this international law called the Carriage of Goods by Sea Act, or COGSA, and it sets a default limit on how much a carrier has to pay if something gets lost. That limit is just $500 per package, unless the owner declares a higher value ahead of time. And that brings us to the big money question for the modern age of shipping. When you've got 128 cartons of clothes packed inside one of these giant metal shipping containers, is that container one single package?
The difference here is massive. The shipping line argued that the two containers were two packages, so their total liability would be a measly $1,000. But the insurers argued, no, each of the 128 cartons is its own package, which would put the liability at $64,000.
So what did the court do? Well, they looked at how other courts had handled this and found a really smart, elegant solution. The rule became this. If you say on the shipping documents how many little boxes are inside the big container, then each of those little boxes counts as a package. And wouldn't you know it, in this case, the bill of lading, that's the shipping contract, was crystal clear. It said 2 containers and then right there in parentheses, 128 cartons. The shipper had declared exactly what was inside. All right, so now that they've figured out what a package is, the court can finally do the math and bring this whole decade-long fight to an end. Okay, let's follow the court's math here.
First, they take the 128 cartons that were declared, they multiply that by the $500 limit, which gives them a maximum liability of $64,000. But, and this is key, the law says you can't be liable for more than the stuff was actually worth. Since the insured value was only $46,583, the carrier was ordered to pay that full amount. And the same logic, the same clear-cut approach, was used for all the other cargo that went down with the ship, from garment fabrics to lance pipes and surveying tools. It finally brought this very long story to a close.
This landmark ruling really set the standard for the container age, a standard that has shaped shipping law for decades. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? As we start moving into a new era of drone deliveries and autonomous ships, what's going to be the next container conundrum that the courts are going to have to figure out?